So my name is Ellis Freeman, and I'm the curator here at the Minnesota Discovery Center. Being a curator means that I get to research and develop both temporary and permanent exhibits, as well as take care of our 3D objects collection to make sure that it's preserved for future generations. So today, we're going to explore our exhibit on the immigrant journey to America. But before we get to do that, I do want to cover a few different topics. The first being, the normal story is that European immigrants came to Minnesota, and that's essentially when history starts. That is incorrect, actually. We weren't the first people to inhabit this land. We're actually on the ancestral homes to the Dakota and Ojibwe people. And this is important because if we don't acknowledge this, we have a chance of erasing their history. And the Ojibwe still call this region home, and their place within our community is just as important as anyone else's. The second thing that I would like to address is just, as we talk about immigration today, which is a pretty big topic, I do want you to think about how some of these things and the stories that you're going to hear can relate to you today. I know we tend to think that history happened a long time ago and it has no relevance to us today, but my job for us in this video is to prove to you that it is. So just please take time and think about how these things can relate to your day-to-day life. So as you heard in the opening of this video, the journey to America was a pretty long and lengthy, sometimes dangerous one. What made people trek across the giant ocean and come here from Europe? Well, let's take a dive into history and find out. So we'll begin this immigration breakdown by first examining who came here. In short, a lot of people from Europe did. In fact, it was probably easier to find someone who wasn't represented on the Iron Range. Based on the 1910 census, we know that there were 25 different nationality or ethnicities on the Iron Range that had a significant population, and this totaled to some 41,000 residents. This mass migration created a diversity on the Iron Range that was rare to see outside of places like New York City or Chicago. Again, based on the 1910 census, we know that at least 50% of Iron Range residents were foreign-born. Many of them didn't have any intention of staying here permanently and would return home as soon as they made some money. And we know that about 1/3 of them actually did return to their home countries in Europe. This boom of immigrants to the Iron Range began in the 1880s, and by the early 1900s, it was in full swing. This was actually part of the largest mass migration in human history, and between 1880 and 1924, 26 million people would leave their homes for America. Since this was a time before any type of websites or travel brochures, a lot of people found out about America in many different ways. Steamship companies would have different advertisements to try and entice immigrants to come over. Stories were also shared with people returning from America to their home countries. And on top of that, letters were also sent back home, and these were so important that everyone in the village would either read them or listen to them being read aloud. For both departing immigrants and those that they left behind, the opportunity to leave everything they knew and come to America was life-changing. Following difficult goodbyes, they believed that America would either provide them an opportunity of refuge, adventure, or safety. They were soon to find out, though, that this wasn't always the case, and sometimes America only offered broken promises. A family would often save for months or even years to send just one person. Normally just one person would come first, and then they would send for the rest of the family later. They would have to travel by railroad or by cart or sometimes even by foot, carrying all the few possessions that they owned. Then once they got to the port of departure, they might even have to wait weeks or months until the ship arrived. And then they were given cursory medical examinations and deloused, and their journey to America began. Most of the immigrants who decided to come to America had to travel in steerage class. This often was the cheapest accommodation, and so they were quick to take advantage of that. However, it's basically just one giant room with hundreds of bunks, which often led to cramped and smelly accommodations. The conditions in steering class were pretty atrocious. Bad smells, poor ventilation, you were basically given no privacy. Toilet and washing facilities were extremely inadequate, and food, if it was even provided at all, was not really that delicious. All in all, you basically had to share your life with a bunch of strangers and had to smell a lot of different things and even hear other people being seasick. The immigrant trade also proved to be highly profitable for steamship companies. They realized that they could cram a bunch of steerage class passengers into one space and make more money off of it than they could with first or second class passengers. As an example, the ship the SS Patricia only had space for 162 first class passengers, 184 second class passengers, but had room for over 2,100 steerage class passengers. So finally, the arrival to Ellis Island. This basically acted as the primary gateway for most European immigrants coming over the Atlantic Ocean. So their main point of entry was right outside of New York City. And this proved to be an extremely busy port. Between 1892 and 1924, 12 million immigrants would come through the doors. And a particularly busy year was 1907, when just that year alone, 1 million people came through Ellis Island. Class discrimination was in full swing, and it was extremely rare for first or second class passengers to even have to enter Ellis Island. On the ship, they were just given cursory medical examinations and then allowed to go straight to New York City from there. It was a little different though for steerage class passengers. Thought was that if you could afford a ticket for first or second class, chances are you wouldn't become dependent on America for aid. So steerage class passengers were treated much differently. They were going to have extensive medical examinations on Ellis Island. They were ferried from their ship, usually in open air and all kinds of weather, and then sent to Ellis Island where they would await their examinations. Once they landed on Ellis Island, the feared examinations began. Nicknamed both the Island of Hope and the Island of Tears, an immigrant's fate was in the hand of the examiners. One wrong answer meant that you could be sent back to Europe. Examiners watched arrivals closely for any type of mental or physical defects. If any were noticed, the immigrant would be marked with a certain symbol in chalk on their coat and pulled aside. Each symbol would then represent a different defect. In addition to these cursory examinations, examiners would also try and look at the immigrant's eyes for signs of the contagious disease trachoma. This often proved to be a very traumatic experience for a lot of people. Essentially, what would happen is the examiner would walk up to that certain individual with either their fingers or they would use a button hook, which was used to lace boots, and they would flip the eyelid back. If there were any signs of trachoma, that was an automatic excuse to be deported back to your home country. So just imagine the fear and confusion of a stranger who probably doesn't speak the same language as you walking up and trying to grab at your eyes. Keep in mind that you had been on a ship for at least weeks or maybe months at a time in really terrible conditions. You were probably hungry, maybe a little bit depressed, and extremely sleep deprived. Following the eye examinations, they were questioned rigorously based on the information they provided at the ship's manifest before they came over to America. If any answers didn't match perfectly, again, they were automatically deported. They were also questioned pretty extensively on whether or not they held any radical political beliefs. America wasn't too kind to those types of people. If an examiner thought that a particular individual showed signs of mental defects, they were set aside and asked to take crudely designed intelligence tests. One of these essentially looked like a flattened out version of Mr. Potato Head. Examiners didn't really explain too much to these immigrants. Keep in mind there's a language barrier, you're a little bit scared because you don't really know where you are. If they didn't finish these in time or if they had too many questions, that was also probably grounds to become deported. Also keep in mind that they might be separating families as they do this. Maybe one individual passes it, but their relative doesn't. So then they have to go back to their home country while the other person is allowed to stay in America. In 1914, nearly 1 out of every 1,000 immigrants was sent back for a mental defect. On average, examinations took anywhere between 3 to 7 hours until the immigrant was finally allowed to continue their journey onto their final destination. So now that we've covered a little bit about who came here and what their average journey was like, let's talk a little bit about why they came here. What made them, again, leave everything that they knew behind, carry their small possessions that they had, and come to a place that they practically knew nothing about. So the majority actually came for economic or monetary reasons. A lot of different money-related problems were going on in Europe, such as having issues with their farms, and jobs like logging and mining on the Iron Range proved to be incredibly enticing. So America offered at least the possibility of bettering your future, but that possibility didn't always get fulfilled. Mines on the Mesabi Range opened officially in 1892, which meant that there was a big demand for labor. The other thing that differed between the mining that happened on the Mesabi versus places like on the Vermilion Range near Ely is that these types of jobs were what they called unskilled, which meant anyone could do them and you didn't need to have a background in mining. So again, this proved incredibly enticing for a lot of immigrants who needed at least some type of chance for better economic future. On top of this, mining companies were also able to exploit this type of labor because they didn't have to pay them a lot of money to do it. The first wave of immigrants actually came from a lot of other states in the Midwest. In the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, copper mining was pretty big. Other places in Wisconsin were also doing iron mining. As more jobs opened up here, they left those mines to come to the Iron Range. And then they would write back home talking about the possibility here, and that's triggered then the second wave of immigration. So once they started working in the mines, they realized that working conditions conditions were pretty bad. Things were really harsh, and the mining companies, again, didn't really make this easier on them. A lot of immigrants spoke different languages, and the mining companies took advantage of this by putting men together who they knew could not converse. And this was done to ensure that the workers would not form a union. Furthermore, mining companies were also incredibly biased with how they hired and how they put people in certain positions. If you were an American-born citizen, or if you came from a country in Europe that was deemed white, such as you were British or Cornish or Norwegian, you were often given higher positions within the mines. Those from Southern or Eastern Europe countries were deemed a little bit lower on the hierarchy and given the most dangerous and low-paying jobs. In the early 1900s, people from Finland or Italy or many countries in Eastern Europe were not considered white, and they were thus thought of as both intellectually and physically inferior. Community leaders also didn't let them live in the nicer parts of town. Those were normally reserved for mining higher-ups or, again, American-born citizens. Oftentimes, these people then had to form their own communities in the more desolate or outskirts of town. And again, this was also usually created around your ethnicity. So Italians usually lived with fellow Italians, Finnish people usually lived with fellow Finnish people. For newly arrived immigrants, living conditions were stark and highly controlled by the mining companies. The mining companies did attract them to the area because they promised a job and a house. However, like with other things, these promises were not always kept. Sanitation in the mining camps was the responsibility of the mining companies, and they left much to be desired. They would try and do the bare minimum as cleanup, and the only things that they promised their workers was a house, a stove, and hay for bedding. Infectious diseases found in homes was actually pretty common at this point in time. This was primarily due to the fact that you had open sewers, outhouses in the backyard, cramped living conditions, and no running water. Typhoid and smallpox outbreaks were common enough diseases. So to get a sense of just how cramped living conditions were, there was one example with a mining location near Eveleth. For 360 miners, there were only 25 houses. This means that on average, there were 15 people living in just one house. The community composition during the early years of immigration was predominantly men. Women were severely outnumbered in these types of communities, and this was the case for several reasons. The first being that, like I've mentioned previously, families could only save up enough money to send for one person at a time to go to America. So initially, it was usually the man of the household who would come over here and then send for other family or children later on. The second thing is, again, like I mentioned previously, many immigrants didn't plan on living in America permanently. They were here to make money for a few years and then head back to their home country. Because the workers were primarily single, a lot of them lived in boarding houses. Boarding houses were essentially giant houses that were owned by either a family or an individual, and they would rent out all of their rooms to miners and provide them with meals and maybe a few other amenities. For women who did travel to America, working in boarding houses was a common enough job. While it might not have been as deadly or as dangerous working in the mines, it was just as grueling type of work. Hours were extremely long. The average for every single week was about 75 hours, and you could work up to over 100 hours per week. Pay was also pretty bad, at an average of about 10 cents per hour. Living in a boarding house also meant that life was in constant motion. Working in the mines was shift work, which meant that if you were working in the mines, chances are someone was sleeping in your bunk. Then by the time that you got done working and went to go to sleep, that person was then going to work for their shift in the mines. This was often called hot sheeting. Every community across the Iron Range did provide some type of social space for workers or just residents in general to try and relax. These included saloons, labor halls, grocery stores, barber shops, and even churches. Again, usually organized along nationality or ethnic lines, this allowed for people to congregate and talk with people from their home countries. The saloon was central to life on the Iron Range. Not only did it allow people to blow off a little bit of steam, but is also incredibly important for social and political reasons. Usually, when you first arrived on the Iron Range, you would head to your nationality's bar. Talking to either the bartender or the bar owner, they would try and help you find a job on the Iron Range. The other thing that was beneficial was talking with bartenders, is that they would help give you social connections so you could try and survive the harsh life on the Iron Range frontier. Another important gathering space for a lot of immigrants was their labor or union halls, and this was essential to building working class solidarity. And the sizes of these varied from either one-room buildings to something as extravagant as the Virginia Socialist Opera House. And these types of larger places offered a wide variety of educational opportunities for local individuals. So this type of opera house would often have plays or musicals. They had pool halls, a library, and even meeting rooms for speakers to come and talk about different types of topics. Working in the mines provided a meager living for most individuals. In order to try and supplement this and to make sure that their families could stay fed, a lot of immigrants had expansive gardens. So rather than the backyards that you see today, where it's primarily just a lawn and maybe some chairs, everything was filled with vegetables. And this served a lot of different purposes, and they would grow a lot of things that they had maybe in their home country. Certain groups would grow specific types of crops. A lot of these would be staples such as potatoes, cabbages, rutabaga, tomatoes, all of those types of things to try and make the family as self-sufficient as possible. Gardens, as many of you might know, actually take a lot of work to maintain. So a whole family would try and either water together or plant different things together. And during harvest time, they would take a lot of the food that they made and then preserve it and save it for winter to again try and survive the harsh winter months on the Iron Range. So while thousands of immigrants came from a lot of different countries, there are three predominant groups on the Iron Range, and those are people that came from Finland, Italy, or many different Eastern European countries. So a lot of you guys watching this may have strong ties to any of those three regions. The first major wave of Finnish immigrants actually came from other Midwestern states. Like I mentioned before, mining was pretty popular in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and there was some mining happening in Wisconsin. So these were the first Finns to arrive on the Iron Range. They would then mail letters back home, and then the second wave was soon to follow. Additionally, Finnish immigrants tended to have some radical politics, and so it didn't take long for them to begin to clash with mining bosses. Eastern Europeans also traveled to the Iron Range in large numbers. Collectively, individuals from the countries Bulgaria, Croatia, Serbia, Slovenia, Montenegro, and Macedonia are considered Eastern European. So the last of what I like to call the big three were those who came here from Italy. And they were also attracted to the range for similar reasons such as mining and logging jobs. It also didn't take them long to find a market for winemaking, and MTC is actually lucky enough to have several wine presses in our collection. While all immigrants had their own histories, languages, and cultures, they generally all had a shared experience when dealing with native-born Americans, and that was open hostility and discrimination, and this was generally only because of where these immigrants came from. Mining officials labeled Italians as inefficient and worthless, fit for but the lowest grades of work in the open pit mines. Finns were considered just as fit, and tensions soon kept rising. Then these tensions finally broke during the 1907 strike. Again, anti-immigrant sentiment was high, and they even called for the tar and feathering of Italian leader Teofilo Petriella. The same newspaper that called for this tar and feathering also labeled the strikers as the offscoring of Europe. And they further went on to say, more than one half of the men who formed the parade came into town from the Chisholm end of the district, and it was a mark of note that fully 90% of those in line were Finlanders. The remainder of the motley crowd was made up of Austrians, Italians, and Montenegros, not one American appearing in the line. 9 years later, during the 1916 strike, they would also make similar remarks in the newspapers. One newspaper took a very pro-American stance and proclaimed, "Americans must rule. They have the right to rule. They have the brains to rule. They have the power to rule. A great majority of the people are real Americans. They believe in law and order. They do not believe in mob rule, and the mob has ruled in Biwabic long enough." So these statements were all made as poor working-class immigrants were simply trying to eke out a meager living on the Iron Range. They went on strike against the largest corporation in the world and demanded that they and their families deserved better. As a result, they were insulted and threatened by English-speaking newspapers who rarely gave any type of chance to understand where the miners were coming from. So these anti-immigrant sentiments only heightened during World War I. This era of Iron Range history is steeped with anti-labor, anti-foreign, and anti-Catholic hysteria. This was only heightened as Minnesota created the Minnesota Commission of Public Safety. This agency was immediately formed after America entered World War I in April of 1917. Initially, it was designed to help Minnesota prepare for the war effort, but it soon turned into a witch hunt for anyone they deemed disloyal and suspect. They used surveillance, intimidation, and fear on Minnesotan residents, and the Iron Range became a primary target for this. Because the range was so filled with different types of immigrants, they thought that these people were dangerous and life-threatening to Minnesotans. Perhaps the group that was least tolerated, at least on the range during these years, were those who came from Eastern Europe. They were considered to be part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which happened to be at war with America. One Serbian living in Chisholm remarked that there was a conspicuous difference between the native-born Americans and us immigrants, not only in the way we lived, but also in our outward appearance. Most of us had large handlebar mustaches, which neither the scissors nor the razor had marred. We shaved on the average of once a week. On the streets, we strolled lazily in groups, talking loudly in our Serbian tongue and gesticulating wildly and expressively. Under these circumstances, we were closely scrutinized and observed with suspicion by Americans. Native-born Americans and Northern Europeans were quick to stereotype Eastern Europeans. They would characterize them as dark, shaggy, brooding, and often foreboding. One magazine said that they lived very much like cattle and spent much of their money on liquor. Of matters on sanitation and other factors of American progress, which we deem vital, they know nothing. Of course, these stereotypes aren't based in anything in reality and are chalked up to simple xenophobia. That didn't stop American-born citizens from still criticizing these immigrants. And it also didn't stop that these immigrants often enlisted to fight overseas during World War I or continued to work in the mines for the war effort. The Finns were another group that were highly targeted during this time in history. A lot of them were members of the Industrial Workers of the World, which was a radical union. Their politics were also pretty radical, which made them a prime target for the Minnesota Commission of Public Safety. Many Finns were actually arrested during the summer of 1917 for failing to register for the draft. Now, they did this for many reasons. Some were against the war, and some simply didn't know that they had to register for a draft. Regardless, they were labeled as slackers and were forced to either stay in jail or register for the draft or promise that they would work in the mines and be loyal to America. Things got so bad for Duluth Finns that one man was actually tarred and feathered because he refused to register for the draft, and this was done by the Knights of Loyalty. Other IWW members who were Finnish were sent to Chicago for a mass trial that resulted in either being jailed or deported back home. The Finnish newspaper Industrialisti was actually censored during the war as an effort to stop foreign-speaking newspapers from being circulated. All non-U.S. citizens in Minnesota would eventually have to register with the state, and this was part of the Alien Registration Order. This occurred in February of 1918, and any non-American person living in the state had to register all property, whether it be land or personal property, and they could not own firearms at this time. In all, there were some 200,000 people living in Minnesota that had to register under this order, and a lot of them came from the Iron Range. Immigrants on the Iron Range would also have to have a showdown with the Minnesota Home Guard. Now, this group was primarily created to protect civilians during wartime, since all of the troops were sent overseas. However, the Home Guard soon became the Minnesota Commission of Public Safety's de facto police force. The commission would often send them to intimidate immigrants or workers who they thought were going to strike and disrupt the war effort. One particular evening, the Eveleth Home Guard raided the Virginia Socialist Opera House. They said that they would burn down the building if those inside the Opera House would not take down the red flag that they had displayed. Another evening, those members of the Virginia Home Guard as well as the Biwabic Home Guard raided houses to look for immigrants who had failed to register for the draft or had failed to register with the state. Cultures continued to clash during this time period as the U.S. and Minnesota started to implement more Americanization programs. The biggest one of this dealt around language. Now, most people wanted any type of immigrant or citizen to speak English. This didn't really rub first-generation immigrants the right way, as language is pretty central to who you are as a person. During World War I, school teachers were only allowed to teach in English. Many foreign-speaking newspapers were often heavily censored or monitored during this time. And this didn't stop after World War I ended. St. Louis County, where we lived, continued to try and implement programs that would push the English language. Concerned that there were too many foreign languages being spoken on the Iron Range, the St. Louis County School Board decided to implement the program We Speak English in 1924. It was thought that only by learning English could foreigners start to truly appreciate American ideals. School children would even wear buttons saying, "We speak English," and they would have certificates that said, "We believe that in order to be true Americans, we must speak the language of America. We therefore pledge ourselves to speak English at school at all times and at home as far as possible, and to encourage and teach others to do the same." Many Finns viewed the change to speaking English only as an attack on their heritage and their culture. First generation were very reluctant to give up their native tongue. However, this was a losing battle because second generation immigrants were quick to adopt English as their primary language. Learning English would eventually become essential to becoming a US citizen. Once women gained the right to vote, they could no longer just become citizens because their husband passed the test. Also, husbands couldn't become citizens unless their wives also passed the test. Many Eastern European immigrants were then quick to want to learn English and started to attend night classes. In an effort to reach women in the home, a lot of teachers would also go to individual homes and instruct them in English. Immigration to the Iron Range soon began to dramatically taper by the middle of the 1920s, and this was the case for several reasons. The first being that Congress passed the Immigration Act of 1924, which severely limited immigrant people coming from specific regions across the globe. Now, they targeted both Southern and Eastern European immigrants because they didn't want them to coming in huge numbers like they were before. This also banned anyone from Asia entry into the United States. They used quotas based on nation of origin, and for a region that attracted a lot of people from Southern and Eastern Europe, this meant that there weren't really that many people coming to this region anymore. While this immigration law took effect, at the same time mining operations began to become more mechanized. This meant that they didn't need as many people working in the mines, and therefore they didn't need to hire as many new arrivals. The last reason why immigration really began to taper off is because America was hit with the Great Depression. During the 1930s, our region was hit pretty hard, where we reached levels up to 70% unemployment. So hundreds of people were actually leaving the range in order to try and find jobs elsewhere. Millions came to America in search of a better life. America had offered a promise of hope, but sometimes that promise was broken. Now, those coming to the Iron Range were met with little hospitality, and it was rough going at the beginning. While today looks dramatically different than life did 100 years ago, we still carry a lot of the tradition from our immigrant ancestors. Now, this is reflected in some of the foods that we eat, such as porchetta or portizza, or pasties, or even sarmas, to also maybe the yearly festivals that we attend, such as Lusky Island. The Iron Range is actually very unique in that it's very much still tied to its immigrant ancestry. These experiences, though, also show how America tends to always fear the outsider, or the newcomer, or whoever they deem as the other. And I think our local and our regional history offers us a unique chance to think critically about our history and how it applies for us today. While back then it was different groups from Europe, today we think of an outsider as a very different type of person. So what I really want us to do is think about why we think of these people as outsiders, and maybe reflect a little bit about who we are and where we've come from. So I would like to end our video today with a quote from writer and civil rights activist James Baldwin. "History, as nearly no one seems to know, is not merely something to be read, and it does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. It could scarcely be otherwise, since it is to history that we owe our frames of reference, our identities, and our aspirations."